guys, here come the dollies. They got fresh sinkers, hot coffee, and the sweetest smile.
Hey, everybody. Good morning. Welcome back to the Clubmobile. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, everyone.
We're very excited and honored to have joining us this week Rebecca Crosby Hutchinson, daughter of Hundredth Bomb Group Navigator Harry Crosby. Rebecca, thanks so much for sitting down with us today.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
We're so happy to have you here.
Yes, we are.
Of course, everyone knows that our podcast is about women during the war, and initially it has been women that served in the war, but today we're going to be talking about someone who we find extremely important, who was on the home front with two of the other 100th Bomb Group wives. If anyone has watched Masters of the Air, which you all should have by now, we're going to be talking about Harry Crosby's wife, Jean, who is mentioned a lot in the show. So this is really exciting because when I watched the show, I connected instantly to Jean because she was so mentioned all of the time. Rebecca, did you have a hand in the show mentioning your mother a whole lot? Did you give the behind the scenes guys the letters that I mentioned within the show?
Yes. I first became aware of the project in 2017 when one of the producers attended one of the 100th Bomb Group Foundation reunions, which they have every 2 years. And he had read my father's book, A Wing and a Prayer, and told us that our father would be in the story. But originally, it was going to be, as I understood it, primarily about the two Buckys and Rosie. But then the writer, John Orloff, read my dad's book, which is all about life at the 100th at Thorpe Abbotts and their story. And that he realized that my father could be used to kind of tie the story together because he was there at the very beginning. He was one of the original crews. And so he knew the Buckys. But the Buckys were shot down shortly after Rosie. If you remember from the story, Rosie was a replacement crew. He didn't come to Thorpe Abbotts until the fall. And so the Buckys were shot down very soon after Rosie got there. But my dad was there the whole time. And so he knew the Buckys quite well, and he knew Rosie quite well. So they could use him as kind of a way to weave the stories together. So his part in the story actually grew, I think, from what they originally planned. And I gave them stories. I gave them, one day they asked for samples of my mother's handwriting because they knew that they had written a lot of letters back and forth. And they literally wanted copies of her handwriting because they were so concerned with accuracy. So yeah, we were very involved in helping them in any way we could by providing them information about our parents' story, and particularly dad's, of course, but also mom.
Honestly, finding out that in, I believe it's episode 6, where Harry opens the letter when he's in Oxford, does that mean that that's a copy of your mother's handwriting, essentially?
Well, there's actually a story worth hearing. Our family, I have 3 brothers and sisters, and the 4 of us went over to England the year that they were filming. We weren't allowed to watch the filming because it was deep into COVID, so we couldn't be on the set, but we got to see the sets. And when we went to the one that was my father's barracks, there was a long row of barracks, and I immediately said, that one must be Dad's. I pointed to the one that had a phonograph next to it because my dad took a phonograph, which plays into the story later. But so we walked over to what was his bed, and my older brother went to the side table, to the bedside table, and said, God, these are Mom's letters. And he thought that they were actually my mother's letters. And at the time, I didn't realize that he thought they were her actual letters. But when we got back to the States, he was telling somebody, yeah, they even had my mother's letters. And I said, no, those weren't Mom's letters. Those were letters that they created, the prop department created, but they looked so real that my older brother thought they were my mother's letters. And we
Oh my
never sent them
God.
originals, but we sent them handwriting samples. And they had recreated her handwriting samples so accurately that her son thought they were her letters. This is a true
Wow.
story.
That's
Wow.
So,
amazing.
yeah,
That's
that's how
wonderful.
careful they were to.
That's
Yeah,
that's incredible.
absolutely.
I think probably the best place to really start would be, how did your parents meet? Because
Sure. So
you could
my
tell they love each
mother,
other so much
it took a
that
while. It took a while. So my mother grew up in a small town in Missouri. She was the daughter of a grocery store owner and a housewife. And she went to the University of Iowa. And my father grew up in Iowa. His parents were actually divorced when he left high school. He had an older sister who died, so he was essentially an only child from the time he was about 4 on. And his dad and mother moved around a fair amount. So they met at the University of Iowa in the late 30s. He was 4 years older than she was, so he was ahead of her. But they were friends. But my dad tells a story that when he saw her at the college union at the University of Iowa in I'm guessing it was 38, 39, somewhere in there, he said to the guy that he was in the room with, that's the girl I'm going to marry. And, like saw her across a crowded room kind of story. And he always told us that. But she didn't know that. And they were really very good friends for a very long, like for 3 years. And then finally, apparently he always had his eye on her as a wife, but she didn't see it that way. She just thought he was a wonderful friend. And I have a letter that if you want, I can just read you an excerpt. This is in February of 1943. So they've now known each other for 3 or 4 years. He is in training to be a navigator. So, Pearl Harbor has happened. He enlisted right after Pearl Harbor, like lots of guys did. And he was in navigator training. And she had graduated by that time and was working in Dayton, Ohio at a radio station. So should I read this? Is that
Yeah,
yes,
okay?
please.
please.
So he writes, it's a long letter, but she says, Bing. So she called him Bing, named after Bing Crosby, who was a famous singer at the time. My father's name was Harry Crosby, but I never heard her call him Harry ever. She always called him Bing. So she says, Bing, concerning ourselves, we've both been skirting something that has undoubtedly occurred often to both of us. Let's face it reasonably. As far as I'm concerned, you've got darn near everything I've ever wanted in a man. And I gather that I seem to answer your qualifications pretty well. But look, my dear, we haven't seen each other for over a year, and at that point, our relations were not far beyond the brother-sister stage. I've deliberately tried to keep from considering you as anything else until very recently. You see, I'm being very honest, and I don't know exactly why, except that you have always been such a perfect and understanding sort of person, and I liked to confide in you. I've told you my troubles, and you always made me feel better. But another reason was that I have seemed to be in some kind of romantic hot water ever since I've known you, and I needed you in that position, so I kept you there, which was pretty agreeable to you most of the time. This thing is, Bing, that you can't build a happy marriage on just mutual interests and common desires and likings any more than you can on purely physical desire, at least not at our ages, or so I think anyway. Whether there's more than that between us is yet to be discovered when we see each other again. So she was 21, he was 24. That was February of 1943. In March 1st, he goes AWOL, borrows some money from a buddy of his, goes AWOL, hitchhikes by Air Force airplane or Air Corps airplane halfway across the country to Dayton, Ohio, shows up on her doorstep and proposes to her. This is like a month after this letter from her. Yeah. What he told us was he got another letter in between that showed that she was really in the dumps and she was upset about her job. It wasn't going the way she wanted, and she was depressed. And he thought, okay, here's my moment. So he goes AWOL, goes to her, and she doesn't say yes right away when he's there. She says, I think I ought to think about it and I'll write you. So
Thanks
he
for
has
coming
to
all
go
this
home.
way, but
Exactly. So he has to go home, but go home without an answer. But she writes him right away and says
yeah,
yes. And this is we have that letter too, but it's kind of private, so I keep that one
yeah,
private. But
of course.
Of
but
course.
then she writes to her parents who have never met this guy and said, well, I told you that Bing came to see me, but I didn't tell you he came to ask me to marry him. And then I said yes, or rather, I told him I wanted to think about it with him gone instead of so close to me, and I'm writing him tonight. I know this will surprise you. It rather surprised me too, but I know I'm right. I would give anything if I had been at home and you could have gotten a chance to know him. I know you'll like him. He wants me to marry him April 18th because it's his birthday, but I think that's too soon, and I want to wait about 3 months anyway. I would normally probably put it off longer than that because, in a way, I'd like to work a little longer, save my money, and do some of the things in a way of sewing and things I always thought I'd do before I married. But the war changes that, and I can't ask him to wait any longer than that, nor do I want to. He's safe for a while, but he may be sent across any time after 6 months. I have no right to ask him to wait any longer and don't know what luck I'll have with 3 months even, except that everything I do is just about right. I wish I could talk to you because I know this was a shock. What a shock it will be. And I want you to understand, please don't throw war marriage at us because it isn't. We've known each other well for 3 years, and it seems he's been in love with me or almost scared of me for most of that time, which I didn't realize until he left for the Air Corps. Certainly, we know each other well enough to know what we're getting into. As far as his eligibility in your eyes is concerned, he ought to fit. He's unusual in that he doesn't drink or smoke, even in the Army. He worked practically all of his way through school and is good at handling money, and he will always take care of me. Isn't this a funny letter? I never tried to explain the man I want to marry to my parents before. So anyway,
She
kind
seemed
of sweet.
so funny and so witty and sharp
Yes.
that I wish we had got a whole, a whole readout of these in the show. I wish that there had been a moment where even like a voiceover narration would have been,
Yeah.
because she's so
But it's
funny.
also, it strikes me though, she's also quite level-headed.
Yeah.
She's kind of looking,
She's
he
given
can
it.
handle money, he'll take
Yeah.
care of me, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink, I've known him for a long time. She's she's fairly level-headed, and in February she's saying, look, we don't even know if we've got anything here. A month, probably less than a month later, he asks her to marry him. She says yes. They actually got married. He wants to get married on April 18th, which again is only 2 months after that letter when she's saying, I don't know what, we're really just brother and sisters, aren't we? And he wants to get married on April 18th because it's his birthday. She wants to wait, and they got married on April 11th. So
So
that
before
just
either
kept
of
getting
them.
stuck.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I'm sure, that's because of the war. They
Yeah.
knew that he was going to be going over sometime. They wanted some time before he went over as much as they could have. So they got married on April 11th, and he left for the war on May 30th. So they had from April 11th to May 30th.
Wow.
So what's that? Like,
6
6 weeks of
weeks.
married life
Yeah.
before he went over. And I have a letter that my dad wrote his father the night before he left for the war. And he says, Dear Father, the day is here. Tomorrow I leave for the war. I don't know what to think about it. I'm rather scared. It's a pretty big ocean to cross and a pretty big war when I get there. Yet it's all a gamble. Life is all a gamble. People drop dead on street corners. So,
He
anyway,
was
so they
also
had this.
extremely level-headed.
Yes.
He was
Yeah,
also as
yeah,
sensible as Jean was.
yeah.
Um,
And I think they were.
did they get a honeymoon? Like, did they get some time to spend together before
I
he went overseas?
I don't think they I never heard about a real honeymoon. I mean, they did. I think they did go to the Ozarks, which is a lake area in the Missouri in the Midwest. I think they might have gone there. They went someplace for a couple of nights, but basically not. She followed him in training, and I quite honestly I can't remember. I think they were probably in Boise, Idaho, where the 100th Bomb Group trained in different places, and
Right.
I haven't quite got that straight about which place they were, but I know she was with him in Walla Walla, Washington, and I believe she was also with him in Boise, Idaho. And she was also, apparently, I've seen letters that indicate that she was with him in Kearney, Nebraska, which is where the 100th Bomb Group took off to go to England. And she apparently was there. It was in, I believe it was in Boise, Idaho, that she met the other two women. She met Margaret Blakely, who was Ev Blakely was Dad's pilot. And she met Gerry Hamilton, who was married to Howard Hamilton. Both of them are in Masters of the Air a little bit. Howard Hamilton was shot down, and he was in some of the POW scenes because I think he was their navigator originally, but he ended up in a different group, if I've got that right. But they were all newly married wives. The other two women didn't know their husbands anything like 3 years. I think they met them while they were in the service. They only knew them a few weeks or months, I believe, when they got married. But then, so that the three wives were there, and they decided amongst themselves that they could live together and get jobs in Chicago. I don't think any of them had or lived in Chicago before, but one of them had an aunt or an uncle that lived in Chicago. So the three wives decided that when the guys go over, they will room together. And so they did. And my mother got a job in I can't remember now if it was a radio or a television station. Probably was, I'm not sure. Television was no, it wasn't television. I believe it was radio. And the other two women had secretarial jobs, I believe. So they lived together in Chicago for a year while their husbands were all over at Thorpe Abbott's.
I love the way that it just kind of is this natural morale for the three of them, that they just kind of decided, well, it's better than being alone, right? It's better than sitting home alone and worrying. At least we can keep each other company and we can worry together in a way.
Yeah.
But
and that they chose not to be with go home to their parents, which I think probably a lot of wives did. Gerry Hamilton was, I believe she was an orphan, I believe. She grew up, I believe I'm right about that. So she didn't have family to go back to, but the other two did, and they chose not to. No, they did try to take advantage of this time to be kind of young working women,
right.
Which was very, reasonably unusual in those times.
It was, but it also, I guess,
they were clearly looking to support each other.
It was unusual for women to kind of live together like that, but I feel like maybe Winnie would feel the same way. The home front during the war was really it was a time for the girls. It was a time for women to show what they were made of and what they could do, and that they could do it on their own. I think that the three of them really stuck together and stuck through that together is such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and they did remain friends. I mean, well into well after the war. I mean, I know. I remember that my family visited with the Hamilton family. I don't know where everybody was living. I think in the Midwest. We lived in Iowa after the war, and my brother was born at the end of World War II, but the three of us, the younger children, were born in Iowa when my father was back teaching. And the others, I believe, were in the Midwest too. So they remained, good friends, and including the women. They had gone through a pretty remarkable thing together.
Even if it was only for the 1 year, but obviously that year was chaotic and hectic. Was there ever in your mum's letters to her parents or to your dad, was there ever sort of a friendship breakdown due to the fact that Margaret's husband and of course your dad had survived that crash at Ludham, but Howard Hamilton had been shot down? Was Gerry ever sort of you know, obviously she was upset, but would she take it out on the other girls in some kind of unfairness?
I think it was very difficult. So he was the Brennan raid was October 8th, 1943. Ev Blakely was the pilot. My father was the navigator. They barely made it back. It's sort of told in Masters of the Air, but it's not shown. It's not one of the
I wish
missions that
we'd have
they
seen
actually
it.
showed us.
It's
Yeah, of course
it's a
we did
common
too, but we
conversation.
understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Hamilton was shot down during Munster, which, if you remember, that one is shown in Masters, and that's the one where Rosie Rosenthal is the only one that it's the only plane that comes home.
Right.
Is the one. Well, Howard Hamilton was in one of the other planes that got shot down, as was Frank Murphy, Chloe's grandfather that you heard about in the earlier podcast. So it was Munster was 2 days after Bremen. So, our dad survived. Gerry Hamilton's husband did not. She did not know, however, what had happened to him from October. It happened on October 10th. She didn't know, I believe it was January, that he was a POW. She didn't know if he was dead or alive for 3 months. For 3 months. Meanwhile, my mother and Margaret Blakely are getting letters from their husbands still. And that was really hard on Gerry. And I have one letter that my mother wrote to her parents. This is November 1st. So this is in the time, it's after the Bremen mission. Mom has heard about Bremen from my father because he wrote a lot of letters about it. He was devastated. He was terrified. He was devastated. He couldn't believe they made it through. He made a point of saying the only reason I'm still here is because of Ev Blakely, the pilot of the plane, and the gunners. He talked about how good the gunners were. So anyway, she's heard about this mission, and Gerry Hamilton by this time knows that her husband's missing, but doesn't know anything about him. And she writes a letter November 1st to her parents, who were back in Missouri at the time. It says, dear folks, I'm so very tired and grumpy tonight that I really shouldn't attempt to write at all, I suppose, but I decided it's better to gripe to you than to Bing. Again, that's the name for my dad. Or to snap at the girls. She's talking about her roommates, which I've nearly bit my tongue off trying not to do tonight. It seems to me they've been griping at me all evening long, and I'm just not in the mood to take it with a smile. No doubt it's just because I'm so tired. But jeepers, I try to be considerate and especially nice when they're tired or not feeling well, but they never seem to think of doing the same for me. I guess I'm just feeling abused and sorry for myself, and I hate people who do that. But tonight I can't help it, and I've got to get rid of it before I write to Bing. He needs good letters now, more than ever, for every letter I've had from him since the crash has been so sort of quiet and tired and not like him. Tonight, though, I feel like writing him to come get me and take me away, anywhere but Chicago. Oh my, I shouldn't write you all this stuff. You'll only worry. And before you get this letter, I'll be all happy and high spirits again, I know. And I share that a little hesitantly because I don't want the families of Margaret Blakely, who I've come to know and care very much about, to think that my mom was bitching about their mom. But I share it because I think it shows the tensions that they were under, the stress that they were under. And of course, you're not going to always be able to be positive, and you're afraid you're losing something. And meanwhile, there's poor Gerry Hamilton, who doesn't know anything about what's going on. It's just you can't imagine living with that for so long. In our day and age, when we can find out immediately everything that's happening. And at the very letter she wrote, there was one kind of cute. Anyway, the very letter she wrote, my chin is up, Mommy. It's kind of battered, but it's up and it will stay there. It's like she's knowing she's got to stay strong and, don't take it out on the other women and the other her roommates.
Right. Wow.
But anyway, I think it must be a good example of the kind of stress that they were under. And they were young, she was 21, 22.
They were all only so young, and to go through all of that at such a young age, it completely throws me off and boggles
Yeah,
my
we were
mind
talking
entirely.
about
They
this
were
last night.
babies.
We were looking at
They
some of
were,
the photos that you sent us of your mom,
Mhm.
and Winnie said, "Wow, they look so young."
Yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah,
to go through something so heavy at that age,
right.
and you put it into comparison of, what are 21 and 22-year-old women now going through? They're not, you can't compare it. And it's
Yeah,
just, it kind of makes you grow. I feel like it would make you grow in a way and kind of not age you, but mature you in a way that this is the reality of life. And we went through this together. And yeah, we might not always get along, but we went through it together. And that's something that nobody else can say we did for the three of
yeah,
them.
yeah. It is, and I think the friendships that they built during the war. I mean, my father certainly talked about that, and he didn't really talk to him much, or I never heard him talk about anybody who died. But I certainly remember him talking a lot about his friends that he
Mhm.
stayed in touch with and got involved with the Hundredth Foundation, and he and Rosie Rosenthal were very good friends. That was very accurately depicted in Masters in episode 9, where they're sitting around talking. And the same thing for the women, that they went through this incredible, not knowing. I mean, deciding to marry somebody and they're going off to war 6 weeks later. You have no idea if you're going to see them again. It's not like in our day and age where many of us, I've been married for 51 years, but I lived with my husband for a year and a half before we got married. It's a different time in
yeah.
terms of the steps even that you take,
Mm. So
really
they
something.
they only lived together for the year. Was there something that happened for them to separate, or was it purely because your dad was coming home for his R&R and so was Ev Blakely? Because I believe they went on that leave at the same time, if I'm correct.
I think that's a right. It was certainly right around the same time. I think what happened first was Gerry Hamilton had a harder and harder time living with them because of her husband being shot down, and she said it was really hard for me. They were getting letters, I wasn't getting anything, and even after they found, she found out, as I said, I'm quite sure it was January. I know it was about 3 months later that he was POW. So 3 months later, she at least knows he's alive.
Yeah.
But I think that was what happened first. Was she decided she was fascinating too. She decided she just couldn't live in that situation any longer. She went off and joined the circus, if you can believe it, the Barnum Bailey Circus. She was a roller skater, and
Really?
she joined the circus, and she actually got injured on the circus train somewhere along the line, and ended up went and lived with Howard's parents because her parents were gone. She grew up. I'm quite sure she grew up in an orphanage. She didn't have family. So after she got injured, after she was in the circus for a while, she lived with her husband's parents until he came home, until the end of the war. So I think that's what started it, was for her saying. And then the men, Ev Blakely and Harry Crosby, got these leaves, and that was after Bremen. I mean, and that's I think that comes out in I believe that's in the show a little bit, that they say, you guys just went through this horrible situation.
Yeah.
You're going to get an R. So Dad went home for a month in the fall of 1944. They met. I think she met him in was either New York or New Jersey, and they had a month together. They went and visited his mother and father, who were again separated at that point, but living in Illinois, and then her parents in a small town in Missouri. My father tells the story. I think it's in A Wing and a Prayer, his book, that they were confident that the war was winding down. They believed the war was winding down. By that time, he wasn't going on as many missions because he had been promoted, and so he was in a more of an administrative role, setting up the missions, preparing the navigators, reading their reports afterwards, making sure they were complete, that kind of stuff. So they were a little more encouraged that he might be safer. and they decided they could risk starting a family. And so my oldest brother, Steve, was conceived in that month when he was home. And Steve, as they show in the end at Masters, he was born on May 3rd, and VE Day was, I believe it was 5 days later. It's either May 7th or May 8th, victory in Europe. So he was literally born less than a week before the war was over. And Dad heard about his birth from a telegram because he was still in England. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think it was Gerry Hamilton who sort of started the, I don't think I can do this anymore.
Yeah.
And
how
also
long was it between your brother being born and then Dad coming home? Because the thought of your mother going through that mostly, even though I know she wasn't alone, but going through that without a husband,
Yeah.
pregnancy and childbirth.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of sad.
Yeah.
Although you remember in those days, childbirth, you didn't do it with your husbands. They weren't anywhere
That's
in
true.
the room. Those were the days where
Yeah.
the husbands dropped them off at the hospital and they
And went
heard
home.
later what they had.
Yeah.
They waited
My-
to light
my
a cigar at the
father-in-law
end. Yeah.
literally-
Yeah.
It's quite
To
different.
wet the
But-
baby's head.
Yeah, right. But yes, she went home, and that's another thing. I think once she was pregnant, she wanted to go home to her mother and father and get help there and
Right.
support and regular doctors and stuff. So I don't know exactly the day that the date of the day that he came back. It was June sometime. It must have been early June, I'm guessing. And again, the war in the Pacific was still going on, so they assumed that he was going to get sent to the Pacific.
Right.
And they were in a car driving with baby Steve and them to Florida. I can't remember if they were going to another Air Force. I think he was, had been assigned to some training station or something when they heard about VJ Day, about victory in Japan after Hiroshima in August of 1945. So they were under the assumption that the war wasn't over for him. They assumed that he was going to end up in the Pacific, but fortunately did not.
Yeah.
So it was, and this is all, I mean, 2 years from when she's saying, I don't know if we're anything more than friends.
And now there's a baby in the car.
Yeah. But
So-
I think that's indication of also what the war did for folks.
Yeah.
It did speed things up.
Yeah.
So after VJ Day, after the war is now over, your dad, he did not continue with his military career at all, because I know a number of the men from the 100th stayed in and made lifelong careers out of
Right.
it. Your dad and your
Yeah.
mom really just focused on their family and you guys.
Yeah, he was always very clear that he didn't want to do the military for a career. I never really heard exactly why, but he was when he was in college, he actually wanted to be a doctor originally. He thought he wanted to be a doctor. He didn't do all that great in the science classes, and he found out he didn't really like them, and he loved the idea of talking about ideas, and that's kind of where he got into teaching and education.
Oh, I love that.
So he made a switch while he was an undergraduate. When the war began, he had finished 1 year of his master's program in English literature, I believe, English writing or English literature at the University of Iowa. So after the war was over, and he commissioned out sometime in 1945, so he didn't stay in at all.
Right.
And then they went back to the University of Iowa, which was where they had met, and they loved Iowa City. And he finished his master's degree, and then he went, and by that time they had 2 kids. My sister April was born in 1947, and they went to Stanford because my father got his PhD in literature at Stanford. In fact, the author Wallace Stegner, for some of your readers who may know his writing, was my father's thesis advisor. He was a great 20th century author. And so they were at Stanford. They lived in a mobile home for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, something like that. And then once he got his PhD, they went back to the University of Iowa. So after he decided not to be a doctor, he was very clear he was interested in education, and the rest of his career was that. And my mother stayed home. When they got back to Iowa, they had two more children, 1950, and then I was born in 1952. And she was a housewife and a professor's wife. They used to give parties for their students. I remember those growing up. We always had parties. They always played charades. They went that route, and they loved Iowa. And then my father got an opportunity to teach at Boston University, so they moved east, which was a very big deal because my mother had grown up in the Midwest. They loved the Midwest. I think that was actually a hard move for her, from what I can tell. But she did a lot of volunteer work, as did many women of her age and period. And then they lived overseas. In 1960, my father was asked to work on curriculum for the Pakistan Air Force. It was then West Pakistan. So we lived overseas. And my mother directed plays with the Pakistani cadets. And they had women in these plays which had never happened before, having women play, in any kind of formal theater stuff. So we lived on a Pakistani Air Force base. We didn't live with other Americans. And my mother directed Arsenic and Old Lace was one of the plays, and the other one, I can't remember the name of it. And she'd done the theater as a young woman in high school and in college, so it was kind of neat. It was like a little bit of a return to her roots.
That's so great
that she got to do that.
I love that. That is so sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I also love that movie. So
it's a great movie. What a great movie.
That's a great movie. Yes.
Yeah, I know it is. It's a great movie. Yeah, it was fun. And so they had the cadets and this. In fact, one of the women who she was Mortimer's wife. I think that's who she was. Anyway, one of them. Oh, no. The woman who played one of the old ladies. She and her husband, Pakistani husband, they actually immigrated to Canada several years later and became lifelong friends with my parents. In fact, I still communicate with the mother, the wife, who's still alive. She's
That's very
incredible.
sweet.
I love that. Oh, I love it.
My parents were very good at continuing friendships,
Yeah. They again, it goes back to the being so level-headed and sensible. I kind of feel like when they had good people around them, they decided to obviously keep them around.
Yeah, keep them around. Yeah. I think that's true.
Yeah.
As much as this episode is about your mother, I feel like we would be remiss to not talk about Masters of the Air and your dad being depicted on television. As you said, you were introduced to the project in 2017. How was watching the final product for you and your siblings?
It was, the anticipation was incredible. I kept getting the reviewed. The date that it would come out kept getting moved back and back and back. So there was, a good strong year where we thought it was going to be then and kept moving. And so it was really quite something. We feel that they told the story really well, but they depicted him very accurately. He did get seasick all the time. He couldn't sing. I remember telling them he could not sing, and they talk about that in the Masters. And he did get really sick. Yeah. I told Kirk Sadusky, who was the producer that had the most contact with the family members, it was painful sitting next to my father in church because his singing was so bad. So my mother, on the other hand, had a great voice, but so they got that stuff really right. And he was fairly self-deprecating. And in this book, he's very self-deprecating.
Yes.
He really thought he was probably the worst navigator, and he might have been in the beginning, but he was a really hard worker. And he knew if I don't get this right, I'm going to die. And while I'm going to die, I'm going to take a whole plane load of my buddies with me.
Right. Yeah.
So he studied, and he gives a lot of credit to the people that made them train all the time. He always said, if we weren't on a mission, we were up in the air training. So I think they really got all of that really right. It didn't feel like it was our dad. My father was tall, and that was one thing that kind of was jolting a little bit for me. He was around 6 feet tall, and
Really? Wow.
Anthony wasn't as tall. Yeah,
Anthony is not tall.
Anthony's not that tall.
Right.
Sorry if
And that
Anthony
part-
Boyle happens to hear this.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think we told him. We got to meet him at the LA premiere, and then he also came to Boston to do a Boston premiere. So we met him at 2 different times. But so it didn't feel like, it's not like you're watching your dad up on the screen. It wasn't like that. But it was right that they got him right, in terms of, he started not knowing what he was doing.
Mhm.
He put his head to the grindstone, and he was a pretty serious guy. He wasn't a drinker. As my mother said to her parents, he didn't smoke, he didn't drink. He was kind of a straight-laced guy for the most part. So it's hard to describe it. It's hard to answer that question directly, except that it doesn't really feel like it's your dad up there. But there were moments that I thought were wonderful. There's a part where his friend Bubbles Payne, I can't remember which episode, was hurt, and he was in the hospital. And my father is there, and he has a letter from my mother. And Bubbles says to him something like, your wonderful wife wrote you another letter, or something like that. And Anthony, playing my father, smiles. I really love that moment, because I think my father always thought he married up. He was really proud of the fact that he finally got this woman to marry him. And he always really felt like, he was impressed with himself that he could, get this woman that he loved for 3 years. So there are moments like that I feel are wonderful. The other one for me is, which I mentioned earlier, was in episode 9, where it's Rosie and Harry talking around the fireplace at the officers' mess at the end of the war. I am sure that Dad and Rosie sat around talking about, the fact that they had dropped bombs and killed hundreds and thousands of people and hundreds of people, and but knowing that that's what you had to do. This was Nazis, and so that part felt very real to me. So it's not exactly like you think that's my dad, but certainly they were very accurate in how he evolved in his time. And so, we obviously were incredibly honored. And the other thing is, my father loved movies. He absolutely loved movies. So for him to know, how badly do we wish he could know that he's in a movie that Spielberg and Hanks did? But so be it. I don't know. I hope that answers your question. It was.
Yeah. That honestly, I would feel a similar way, because I don't think that Anthony Boyle looks like your dad very much, but I sort of feel like after reading the book, he does sort of capture his aura, his self-deprecating
Yes.
humor, the way that he speaks, even Anthony's real voice.
Right.
When Anthony was doing the narration, did he sound like your dad, or was that again?
No,
he just
his
sort of
voice.
made his own.
Voice. I mean, it's amazing, because if Anthony Boyle is from Northern Ireland, he's got this incredible heavy brogue, which he, in fact, that was one thing we had to send them audio tapes of my dad's voice, and then they also got one. They found one later, but and we said to him when we met him at the LA premiere, when we heard Anthony speak, and he's got this Irish brogue, we said, how did you do that? Because it's all gone in masters. It doesn't really sound like our dad's voice to us, but it sure as heck doesn't sound like a guy from Northern Ireland. He's got the American accent. He said, I listened, I had headphones, and every morning before I went on set, they had to travel from wherever they were sleeping to where the sets were. And it was quite a distance, apparently, outside of London. he said, I would put those headphones on and I would listen to your father's voice every morning as I was going to set, trying to get it. So it didn't sound to us like our dad, but it certainly sounded like an American from the Midwest. I mean, he got that right. And I think, the other thing, when we met Anthony, he said, your father was so funny. He kept talking about him being funny. And we all kind of scratched our head because we said, I don't know, we didn't think he was that funny. But when I read I've read A Ring and a Pear several times, and I've read it once since Masters came out. And of course, Anthony read that book. He was lucky because the character he was playing had written a book, so he could, learn a lot. And I understand why Anthony says that, because in the book, Dad is very self-deprecating a lot, more. I think that, that was, he did it more in the writing than he did as a person. Somehow I understood why Anthony looked at him and thought he was this funny guy. I mean, he was a kind of a serious guy in a way, but he did believe that he didn't know what he was doing in the beginning, and he better learn how to do it because he was going to die if he didn't. And I imagine he probably did tell his friends in the beginning, I'm probably the worst navigator the Hundredth's ever seen, or the Air Corps has ever seen. So that part, that humor thing felt a little bit off to us, but I get, because the book is funny. He certainly puts himself down all the time and things that he screwed up and stuff. So I understand that, and he knew how to tell. He was a writer. He knew how to tell a good story too.
Your dad wrote the book. Did he begin writing it before your mother passed, or was it a long time after? Because I'm never sure of the date that he began.
Yeah, my mother died in 1980. She was 58. She died of cancer, and she was sick for only about 7 months. It was pretty awful. So no, the book was written, it was published in 1993. He hadn't started it. He always was going to write the great American novel. We knew that growing up. He taught Hemingway and Faulkner classes. I mean, he wanted to be a writer, but what we were always told was he was going to write a novel about Pakistan, because we had lived in Pakistan in the 60s. And so that's what we thought his book was going to be. And all of a sudden, he remarried after my mom died, fairly soon after my mom died, and lived with Mary Alice and her younger kids. She had much younger kids than us. And so he wrote the book when they were together in 93. He probably started writing it in 90, 91. He says it didn't take him very long. I've heard him interviews where he says it didn't take him very long. So my mother had been dead about 13 years. Her brothers and sisters were still alive, but she had been gone quite a while.
Did you read it as Dad was writing it? Like, was it things that you had already known or heard of? Had he told the stories as you grew up, or was this like a first time hearing about it?
Some of it, and again, I'm the youngest, so I think I might have heard the least amount. My older brother, Steve, the one who's born at the end of the war, tells a great story about how when Dad would give him haircuts, my father cut the boy's hair. And he said, we'd be sitting in the kitchen and I'd be on a step stool and my dad would be cutting my hair. And as he's cutting my hair, he would tell me about missions. So Steve remembers hearing about Bremen, about Regensburg. Those were the two he talked about the most because those were the hardest. So I don't have a memory of that, but I certainly remember him talking about counting the planes coming home, going up onto the control tower and counting the planes. I heard about that a lot. I heard about him living in England and how when he was off on leave, he would, go to England and go to plays and go to movies. Again, he loved movies. He was always trying to go to movies. And again, he talked about his friends, Rosie, Crookshanks, another character that is in Masters that I heard about all my life. They called him Crankshaft. So we certainly heard of it being an important part of his life, but I didn't hear specifics about living at Thorpe Abbott's, for example. And I never heard my mother talk about the year in Chicago. She died young. She was 58 when she died. And I guess I didn't have kids yet. That's right. She died right before my oldest daughter was born. So I was busy being a young person. And so we didn't hear her stories about the war, which is why after she died, I wrote to Margaret Blakely and Gerry Hamilton and said, can you tell me about that year? Because we know nothing. And they were kind enough to send me, their memories of that year. But I'm so sorry that I didn't hear my mom talk more directly about what the experience was for her. So we only have these letters as a window into that experience.
Yeah. I think as well, after reading the article that you wrote for Splasher 6, that gave us also more of an insight into the minimal sort of, the year of them living together. How was it collaborating with the other kids on that article?
Well, that was wonderful. I mean, so I think I mentioned that the 100th Bomb Group Foundation has reunions every other year. And of course, there are very few actual vets from the 100th still alive. And in fact, we just had one in New Orleans, and there were only 300 vets there, all of whom are over 100 years old. But what happens now is that it's family members who come, and we are beginning to feel like it's reunions for us because we're now seeing them. Well, at this one in, where was it? I forget where we were, which one it was. But anyway, I had met Margaret Blakely's daughter at a couple of the reunions, Barbara. So I knew her, but at the other one, I was in line to get my, at the registration desk at the beginning of the reunion. And the woman ahead of me asks the people who are doing the registering, is there anybody from the Crosby family here? And I heard that. I said, yeah, I'm right behind you. And by the way, I'm Harry Crosby's daughter. And she was Howard Hamilton's daughter. So that's the three of us just realized, the three of us who were in this, the daughters of the three women who lived together 80 years earlier, were all at the same reunion together. And there's a picture, which I hope you'll show your viewers, of the three of them from the 1940s that we all call the legs picture, because it's you'll see. But so we sort of tried to recreate that picture with the three of us, except I wasn't wearing a dress. But anyway, because we realized, wow, this is amazing that the three of us are together. And that's when the idea came for us to try to put our thoughts together about what we knew. We each had heard from our mothers. I hadn't heard anything because she was dead, but they had heard a little bit about that year. And that's when we put that letter together. It was that article together. It was really fun. And also talking about, sort of what's our lasting message that we got from our mothers. So yeah, it was wonderful getting to know them and to, realize this common experience that we had.
That's such a full circle moment.
Yeah,
To really
it was really amazing.
Yeah.
It's one of those moments where you so wish that our mothers could know that we were all sitting together.
Yeah. That's so beautiful.
I think that is a really good place to wrap up, because that's such a sweet full circle moment that I'm emotional just a tiny little bit. Just a little bit. But again, Rebecca, thank you so much for coming to talk to
This
us.
has
This
been
has
wonderful.
been a true
Well, thank
pleasure.
you. You're very welcome, and thank you for doing what you do. Anything to sort of keep the story alive. And I really appreciate that you're focusing on the women too, because they had a story to tell as well.
Well, they're not
Thank
just
you very much for letting me a part of it.
Oh, we're so happy
course.
that you wanted to give us your time and share your mom's story with us. We truly believe that the men who served their wives are more than just a footnote in their stories. They have a story that needs to be told, and we will do everything we can to tell those stories. And we're so happy that your mom is the first one we get to share from the 100th.
Well, thank you. We're delighted. I'm glad I could help.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you so
Rebecca.
much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.